4. It is only with vast hesitancies and repugnance that I let my mind go back to Lake's camp and what we really found there. And to think that other thing beyond the frightful mountain wall. I am constantly tempted to shirk the details and to let hints stand for actual facts and ineluctable deductions. I hope I have said enough already to let me guide briefly over to the rest. The rest, that is, of the horror at the camp. I've told of the wind-ravaged terrain, the damaged shelters, the disarranged machinery. The varied uneasiness of our dogs, the missing sledges and other items, the deaths of men and dogs, the absence of Gedney, and the 6 insanely buried biological specimens, strangely sound in texture for all their structural injuries from a world 40 million years dead. I did not recall whether I mentioned that upon checking up the canine bodies, we found 1 dog missing. We did not think much about it till later. Indeed, only Danforth and I have thought all of it at all. The principal things I've been keeping back relate to the bodies, and to certain subtle points which may or may not lend a hideous and incredible kind of rationale to the apparent chaos. At the time I tried to keep the men's minds off these points, for it was so much simpler, so much more normal to lay everything to an outbreak of madness on the part of some of the Lake's party. From the look of things, that demon mountain wind must have been enough to drive any man mad in the midst of this center of all earthly mystery and desolation. The crowning abnormality, of course, was the condition of the bodies, men and dogs alike. They had all been in some kind of terrible conflict, and were torn and mangled in fiendish and altogether inexplicable ways. Death, so far as we could judge, had in each case come from strangulation or laceration. The dogs had evidently started the trouble, for their state of their ill-built corral bore witness to its forcible breakage from within. It had been set some distance from the camp because of the hatred of the dogs for those hellish arcane organisms, but the precautions seemed to have been taken in vain. When left alone in that monstrous wind behind flimsy walls of insufficient height, they must have been stampeded, whether from the wind itself or from subtle increasing odor emitted by the nightmare specimens, one could not say. Those specimens, of course, had been covered with a tent cloth, yet the low Antarctic sun had beat steadily upon the cloth, and Lake had mentioned that solar heat tended to make that strangely sound, and tough tissues of things relax and expand. Perhaps the wind had whipped the cloth from over them and jostled them about in such a way that their more pungent olfactory qualities became manifest despite their unbelievable antiquity. But whatever had happened, it was hideous and revolting enough. Perhaps I'd better put squeamishness aside and tell the worst at last, though with a categorical statement of opinion, based on the first-hand observations and most right deductions of both Danforth and myself, that the then missing Gedney was in no way responsible for the loathsome horrors we found. I've said that the bodies were frightfully mangled. Now I must add that some were incised and subtracted from in the most curious, cold-blooded, and inhuman fashion. It was the same with dogs and men. All the healthier, fatter bodies, quadrupedal or bipedal, had had their most solid masses of tissue cut out and removed, as by a careful butcher. And around them was a strange sprinkling of salt, taken from the ravaged provision chests on the plain, which conjured up the most horrible associations. The thing that had occurred in one of the crew airplanes shelters from which the plane had been dragged out, and subsequent winds had effaced all tracks which could have supplied any plausible theory. Scattered bits of clothing, roughly slashed from the human incision subjects, hinted no clues. It is useless to bring up the half impression of certain faint snow prints in one shielded corner of the ruin enclosure, because that impression did not concern human prints at all, but was merely clearly mixed up with all the talk of fossil prints, which poor Lake had been given throughout the preceding weeks. One had to be careful of one's imagination in the lee of those overshadowing mountains of madness. As I've indicated, Gedney and one dog had turned out to be missing in the end. When we came out onto that terrible shelter, we had 2 missing dogs and 2 men. But the fairly unharmed dissecting tent, which we entered after investigating the monstrous graves, had something to reveal. It was not as Lake had left it, for the covered parts of the primal monstrosity had been removed from the improvised table. Indeed, we had already realized that one of the 6 imperfect and insanely buried things we had found, the one with a trace of peculiarly hateful odor, must represent the collected sections of the entity which Lake tried to analyze. On and around that laboratory table were strewn other things, and it did not take long for us to guess that those things were the carefully, though oddly and inexpertly, dissected parts of 1 man and 1 dog. I shall spare the feelings of survivors, and by omitting mention of that man's identity. Lake's anatomical instruments were missing, but there were evidences of their careful cleansing. The gasoline stove was also gone, though around it we found also a curious litter of matches. We buried the human parts beside the other 10 men and the canine parts with the other 35 dogs. Concerning the bizarre smudges on the laboratory table and the jumble of roughly handled illustrated books scattered near it, we were much too bewildered to speculate. This formed the worst of the camp horror, but other things were equally perplexing. The disappearance of Gedney, the 1 dog that ate uninjured biological specimens, the 3 sludges and the certain instruments, illustrated by technical and scientific books, writing materials, electric torches, and batteries, food and fuel, heating apparatus, spare tents, fursuits, and the like, was utterly beyond sane conjecture, as were likewise the spattered fringed ink blots on certain pieces of paper, and the evidences of curious alien fumbling and experimentation around the planes of all other mechanical devices, both at the camp and at the mooring. The dogs seemed to abhor this oddly disordered machinery. Then, too, there was the upsetting of the larder, the disappearance of certain staples, and the jarringly comical heap of tin cans, pried open in the most unlikely ways and at the most unlikely places. The profusion of scattered matches, intact, broken, or spent, formed another minor enigma, as did the 2 or 3 tent cloths and fursuits which we had found lying about, with peculiar and unorthodox slashings. conceivably due to clumsy efforts at unimaginable adaptations. The maltreatment of the human and canine bodies and the crazy burial of the damaged Archean specimens were all but at peace with this apparent disintegrative madness. In view of just such an eventuality as the present one, we carefully photographed all of the main evidences of insane disorder at the camp, and shall use the prints to buttress our pleas against the departure of the proposed Starkweather Moor expedition. Our first act after finding the bodies in the shelter was to photograph and open the row of insane graves with the 5-pointed snow mounds. We cannot help noticing the resemblance of those monstrous mounds, with their clusters of grouped dots, to poor Lake's descriptions of the strange greenish soapstones. And when we came on some of the soapstones themselves in the great mineral pile, we found the likeness very close indeed. The whole general formation, it must be clear, must be made clear, seemed abominably suggestive of the starfish of the arcane entities, and we agreed that the suggestion must have worked potently upon the sensitized minds of Lake's overwrought party. Our own first sight of the actual body-buried entities formed a horrible moment, and sent the imaginations of Pabody and myself back to some of the shocking primal myths we had heard and read. We agree that the mere sight of the continued presence of the things must have cooperated with the oppressive polar solitude and demon mountain wind in the driving Lake's party mad. For madness centering in Gedney as the only possible surviving agent was the explanation spontaneously adopted by everyone so far as spoken utterance was concerned, though I will not be so naive as to deny that each of us may have harbored wild guesses which sanity forbade him to formulate completely. Sherman, Pabody, and McTeague had made an exhaustive airplane cruise over the surrounding territory in the afternoon, sweeping the horizon with field glasses in quest of Gedney and of the various missing things. But nothing came to light. The party reported that the Titan barrier range extended endlessly to right and left alike, without any diminution in height or essential structure. On some of the peaks, though, the regular cubes and rampart formations were bolder and plainer, having doubly fantastic similitudes to Roerich painted Asian hill ruins. The distribution of the cryptical cave mouths on the black snow-denuded summits seemed roughly even as far as the range could be traced. In spite of all the prevailing horrors, we were left with enough sheer scientific zeal and adventurousness to wonder about the unknown realm beyond these mysterious mountains. As our guarded messengers stated, we rested at midnight after our day of terror and bafflement, but not without a tentative plan for one or more of the range-crossing altitude flights and a lightened plane with aerial camera and geologist outfit, beginning the following morning. It was decided that Danforth and I tried first, and we awakened at 7 a.m. intending an early trip, though heavy winds mentioned in our brief bulletin to the outside world delayed our start till nearly 9 o'clock. I've already repeated the non-committal story we told the men at camp, and were laid outside after our return 16 hours later. It is now a terrible duty to amplify this account by filling in the merciful blanks with hints of what we really saw in the hidden transmontane world. Hints of the revelations which have finally driven Danforth to a nervous collapse. I wish he would add a really frank word about the thing which he thinks he saw alone, even though it probably was a nervous delusion, and which was perhaps the last straw that put him where he is. But he is firm against that. All I can do is to repeat his later disjointed whispers about what it sent him shrieking as the plane soared back through the wind-tortured mountain pass after that real intangible shock which I shared.